The first strike of the sledgehammer barely registered in the stale basement air, just another echo swallowed by damp concrete and mold. But the second hit? That one sounded different, a hollow thud that didn't belong. Marcus Webb had been tearing down buildings for most of his adult life in Harbor County, Wisconsin. 15 years of demolitions meant he could tell the difference between rotten drywall, stubborn brick, and concrete thick enough to break your back. But today, March 23, 2021, he found something that didn't match any category. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love true crime cases, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. Marcus wiped dust off his forehead, lifted the sledgehammer again, and swung. A third impact sent a tremor through his arms, and this time a section of wall fractured, coughing out a cloud of gray powder in the smell of stagnant time. "Hey, Joel!" Marcus shouted, voice echoing. "You gotta see this!" From upstairs, boots thudded across loose boards. Joel Carter, his partner for the day, descended the old basement stairs, flashing a grin meant to hide unease. The abandoned house at 218 Lawson Street, a place neighbors whispered about but no one visited, had been scheduled for demolition. Flooding, mold, broken windows, graffiti, just another casualty on the city's list. But now, as Marcus aimed his flashlight into the section he'd opened, the beam didn't land on foundation. It disappeared into space, a void where no space should exist. The knockoff brand headlights Marcus used flickered once, then steadied, revealing what was beyond. An entire room wedged like a secret between concrete walls. No windows, no doors, no way in or out except the hole Marcus had just created. Joel stepped closer, boots splashing through cold standing water. "What the hell is this? A panic room?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. His breath caught as he took in the walls inside, once painted, though time had peeled them raw. Someone built this room deliberately, then sealed it away. The kind of job you'd never notice unless you tore the house down to its bones. Joel leaned forward, squinting through drifting dust. His light caught something in the far corner, something slumped, bundled beneath rotted fabric. It didn't look like furniture. It didn't look like trash left over from some long-gone tenant. Joel's voice cracked. "Marcus, that's a body." The air went still. Even the water seemed to stop moving. Marcus felt his throat tighten. Sure, he'd found strange things behind walls before. Rusted tools, love letters from decades past, once even a stash of baseball cards worth more than his first truck. But never this. Never human remains sealed behind concrete thick enough to feel permanent. He reached for his phone, hands trembling. He knew full well the service wouldn't reach this far underground, but instinct took over anyway. "We need to call this in, now." Upstairs, after they reached signal, Marcus dialed 911 with fingers slick from sweat. Within minutes, the street outside pulsed with red and blue. Patrol cars blocked off the road. Neighbors leaned against fences, whispering, filming on their phones. Detective Laura Santos, Harbor County PD, ducked beneath the yellow tape, her expression tight. 18 years in homicide made her unshakable, or so she thought. That changed the moment she stepped into the basement. The hidden room felt wrong, like a time capsule someone never meant to see daylight again, a violation of something sacred. Forensics filled the space with floodlights, and as they illuminated the slumped figure in the corner, the truth settled in everyone's chests like cold lead. The bones told their own story, long silent yet unmistakable. "Female," the medical examiner murmured. "Decades in here, most likely. 40, maybe 50 years." Detective Santos felt chills crawl up her spine despite the stagnant heat. Families had lived above this room, families who woke up to breakfast, packed lunches, argued over bills, completely unaware of the tomb beneath their feet. A forensic tech lifted a fragment of rusted metal shaped like a band. "Wedding ring," she noted. Another bagged evidence, a watch with a frozen face, its hands stopped at 10:47. Scraps of clothing clung to what remained of the body. A life once lived, undone stitch by time and secrecy. This wasn't just a body. This was someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone whose absence once tore through people's lives like a storm that never passed. Detective Santos clenched her jaw. Check missing persons going back at least 50 years, prioritized. 3 hours later, under flickering lights and solemn silence, the medical examiner confirmed what locals who grew up here had heard whispered their whole lives. The remains belonged to Evelyn Harper, missing since October 12, 1971. 50 years, one false wall, an entire family's unanswered questions. And for Detective Santos, the same thought echoed over and over. Who built that room? Who sealed it from the world? And how many people walked past this house over half a century, never knowing a secret waited for someone brave, or unlucky, enough to break through the wall? As sirens faded into the night and the house stood silent once again, one thing was certain. This cold case was no longer cold. In fact, it was about to burn. The discovery of Evelyn Harper's remains didn't just make headlines in Harbor County, it cut straight into the heart of the community. For decades, her name had drifted through conversations like a ghost story. Now she was finally found, yet the truth remained maddeningly unfinished. Detective Laura Santos stood outside 218 Lawson Street, arms crossed against the cold wind blowing off Lake Michigan. The house sat behind her like a decaying witness, its windows boarded, its paint chipped by years of storms and silence. Santos's eyes followed a forensics van pulling away, carrying Evelyn's remains toward the medical examiner's lab. It felt like watching the past leave the scene, but also return, demanding answers. Her phone buzzed. "Detective Santos?" she answered. "Dental records match," the voice on the line said. "It's her. It's Evelyn Harper." Santos exhaled slowly. Not relief exactly, but a shift, the kind that comes when questions finally have direction. "Get me her file," she said. "Everything from 71. Back at the Harbor County Police Department, the cold case room smelled like dust and copier toner. Rows of file cabinets lined the walls, each drawer a graveyard of unanswered questions. A clerk pulled a faded brown box from a shelf marked Harper, Evelyn, Missing Person. The cardboard was soft at the edges, tape yellowed with age. Santos opened the box carefully, as though afraid the contents might crumble. Inside were copies of witness statements typed on manual typewriters, photographs sealed into brittle plastic sleeves, and the original missing flyer, Evelyn smiling in black and white, auburn hair pinned back, eyes bright with a life she never got to finish. The first line on the flyer read, "Last seen October 12, 1971. Left home for work, never arrived." Santos sat and began reading through statements. The first page was from Evelyn's supervisor at Harbor Credit Union. Reliable, organized, didn't miss shifts. No reason to believe she'd leave on her own. Next, a neighbor. Evelyn seemed distracted the last few weeks. Different clothes, new haircut, something on her mind. Then a statement from Mary Connors, Evelyn's best friend. "She told me she'd made a mistake, said she didn't know how to fix it. I thought she meant something at work. Now I'm not so sure." Santos flipped the page, her eyes sharpening as she reached Evelyn's husband's statement. "Harold Harper. No fights that morning. She kissed our kids goodbye. She left like always. Then she was just gone." The file noted that Harold had passed away in 1986, heart attack, never knowing what happened to his wife. Finally, a detail Santos had been waiting for. Receipt recovered from scene, Lawson Street Hardware, purchase time stamped 9:12 a.m. Light bulbs, the same type of light bulbs still sold today. The signature at the bottom, owner, Richard Lawson. Santos whispered to herself, Lawson Street Hardware, and the house is Lawson Street too. Interesting. She jotted a note. The next day, the hardware store was first on her list. Before dawn, the gray light of morning filtered through blinds as Santos sipped bitter coffee at her desk. Evelyn's photo sat propped beside her keyboard, a quiet reminder of why the work mattered. Santos checked her watch. Time to move. The bell above the door at Lawson Street Hardware jingled as she walked in. The store felt like stepping back decades. Wood-paneled walls, narrow aisles, old metal shelving stocked with nails and paint cans. A few early customers browsed silently. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 60s, plaid shirt tucked neatly into jeans, white hair combed back. A badge on his chest read, R. Lawson. He recognized her immediately. "You're here about that house, aren't you?" he asked, voice steady but guarded. "I am. Detective Laura Santos. We need to talk about Evelyn Harper." The name made his expression falter. Not surprise, but something older. Regret? Memory? Fear? He motioned her to a small office at the back of the store. The walls were covered with photographs, the store under construction, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, old Harbor County parades. "You worked here when Evelyn vanished," Santos said, sitting across from him. "I was 20. My parents ran the place then." "Do you remember her?" The drive to Samuel Carter's property took Detective Laura Santos along winding two-lane roads that cut through fields still brown from winter. Frost clung stubbornly to the edges of mailboxes and fence posts, and bare trees leaned toward the shoreline like watchers, skeletal and silent. Santos replayed every detail from the cold case file: Evelyn Harper's missing timeline, the receipt from Lawson Street Hardware, the disappearance just blocks from 218 Lawson Street, the house where her remains were found 50 years later. That house had been built by the Carter family, supplied in part by Richard Lawson's hardware store, and Samuel was the last surviving Carter. Too many connections to ignore. She turned onto a gravel driveway nearly swallowed by weeds. Ahead sat a weather-beaten two-story farmhouse overlooking the lake, its paint peeling, its porch sagging. A rusted mailbox at the entrance read Carter, the letters faded but still legible. Santos stepped out of her car just as the screen door opened. A man emerged slowly, as if unsure whether to engage or run back inside. Samuel Carter, late 70s, tall but stooped, gray hair tucked beneath a worn baseball cap. He watched her approach with the caution of someone who had learned that people rarely brought good news. "You must be Detective Santos," he said before she could introduce herself. His voice was gravelly, strained. "Yes, sir," Santos replied. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me." "Didn't exactly agree," he muttered, stepping aside. "But I'm not about to hide from the police either. Come in if you want." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and old coffee. Family photos filled a narrow hallway, black and white portraits of parents long past, snapshots of two young brothers standing beside each other, hammers in hand, smiling in front of a newly framed house. One of them was unmistakably Samuel, the other, slightly shorter, broader shoulders, his younger brother Daniel Carter, the man who had actually built 218 Lawson Street.
"Yes," he said without hesitation. "She was kind. Came in often. Bought household stuff, never made a fuss." He looked up at Santos. "I always wondered what happened to her." Santos leaned forward. "Your parents still living?" He shook his head. "Both gone, years ago." Would they have known Evelyn beyond being a customer? Lawson hesitated, just long enough for Santos to catch it. Dad knew everybody. It was that kind of town. Santos wrote that down. "Do you know who owned the house on Lawson Street back in '71? Lawson nodded slowly. "The people who built it. The Carters. My dad helped them with supplies. Concrete mix, tools, all that." Santos paused. The Carters. The same last name as Joel Carter, Marcus Webb's partner who first saw the hidden room. The thread twitched. Anyone from that family still around? She asked. Lawson swallowed. 1. Samuel Carter, older brother of the man who built the house, lives out near the lake, keeps to himself. Santos stood. I'll need the address. Lawson scribbled it on a torn receipt. When Santos reached for the paper, Lawson didn't let go immediately. You think this has something to do with Evelyn? He asked quietly. Santos met his eyes. I think someone built that room to hide something, and I don't believe in coincidences when someone vanishes and 50 years later we find them in a house connected to the same hardware store they stopped at the morning they disappeared. Lawson released the paper. Outside, Santos sat behind the wheel of her car, staring at the address. Samuel Carter lived 30 minutes away, near the shoreline, an isolated area, harder to spot someone coming. Santos started the engine, but before shifting into drive, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The radio was low, the heater humming softly, Evelyn's photo glowing under the dashboard light. 50 years. 50 years of silence. 50 years of secrets hidden in concrete. Santos gripped the steering wheel. If Samuel Carter knew anything, even the smallest detail, she would find it. And for the first time in decades, the path forward didn't feel cold. It felt like embers glowing beneath ash, waiting for someone to blow life into them so the flames could finally rise. She drove toward the lake, headlights cutting through morning fog, unaware that every mile she traveled pulled her closer not just to answers, but to the truth Evelyn had died for. Santos paused at the photo of the two brothers leaning against a truck, a wooden sign in front reading, Carter Construction, 1966. You and your brother ran a construction business, Santos said. Samuel nodded, closing the screen door with a soft click. Built half the houses on this side of the county. Dan was the craftsman. I handled the operations. Santos looked at him steadily. I'm investigating the remains discovered at 218 Lawson Street. Samuel's shoulders tightened, a slight involuntary reaction. Bad business, he said quietly. Whole town's talking about it. Santos waited, letting silence pull at him. Finally, Samuel sighed and motioned toward a pair of armchairs near a window overlooking the lake. Might as well sit. You're not leaving without answers I don't have. They sat, the old fabric whispering beneath their weight. Samuel stared out at the water for a long moment before speaking. You think Dan had something to do with this, he said, not as a question, but as a weary statement. Santos responded evenly. I think your family built the house where Evelyn Harper's body was found. I think Lawson supplied the materials. I think Evelyn visited that hardware store the morning she vanished. That's a lot of proximity. Samuel rubbed a hand over his face. My brother died in '98, 25 years ago. If he knew anything, he took it with him. Santos leaned forward. Did Evelyn Harper ever come to the house while it was under construction, or after? Samuel shook his head. Not that I ever saw, but I wasn't there every hour either. Santos's gaze drifted to a framed picture on a nearby table. Dan Carter and a smiling woman with auburn hair, her hand on his shoulder, sunlight catching freckles across her nose. Santos froze. The woman looked like Evelyn Harper. She picked up the frame slowly. Is this? Samuel took a sharp breath. His eyes reddened, and when he spoke, his voice trembled. That's her, he whispered. That's Evelyn. Santos's pulse quickened. So she did know your brother. Samuel nodded once. I asked him about her back then. He said they were friends, just friends, but I knew my brother, and I saw the way he looked at her. Like what? Santos asked softly. Like she made him feel alive, Samuel said. Dan was always restless, always wanting more than what a small town could give. Evelyn made him feel seen, I think, and she was lonely, I could tell. Santos set the frame down gently.
Were they having an affair? Samuel hesitated, long enough to betray truth. I never heard him say it, he whispered, but yes, I believed they were. The kind of secret love that burns too hot to last. Santos let those words settle, the weight of them heavy. What happened? Why would Evelyn end up dead in the basement of a house your brother helped build? Samuel stared at the lake, his fingers trembling against the arm of the chair. Dan was passionate, quick to feel, quicker to react. He had a temper when he felt cornered. Samuel swallowed hard. After Evelyn disappeared, he stopped talking for weeks, wouldn't answer questions, wouldn't go near that house again, sold the business within a year. Santos leaned closer. Did he ever tell you anything? Anything at all? Samuel closed his eyes. Once, 10 years before he died, we were out by the workshop behind the store. He'd been drinking. He said, "Some mistakes don't disappear just because you pretend they never happened." Did he say your name? Samuel met her gaze. He didn't have to. A chill drifted across the room, as if the lake breeze had crept through the walls. Santos exhaled slowly. Do you know whether your brother ever returned to the Lawson Street house after construction? Samuel shook his head. I don't think so, but Dan wasn't the only one with keys. Our father had access. Several workers did too, and Lawson himself could come and go. Santos sat back, absorbing every fragment. The threads tangled, not fully forming a picture, but hinting at one. A hidden room, a secret relationship, a woman who said she'd made a terrible mistake before she vanished. Before Santos stood to leave, Samuel looked at her with a pleading expression she didn't expect. Detective, if you find the truth, the real truth, promise me you'll tell me, even if it destroys the last thing I believed about my brother. Santos nodded. I promise. She stepped back into the cold. From the porch, Samuel watched her go, one hand on the railing, as though needing support to stay upright. The lake wind carried his last words to her, barely louder than the waves breaking against the shore. Some secrets don't die, they just wait for someone to dig them up. Santos paused before getting into her car, heart pounding. Evelyn Harper had been missing 50 years, but the people tied to her story were still alive, still haunted, still breaking under the weight of what they hadn't said. As Santos pulled away, she didn't head straight back to the station. Instead, she drove to Harbor County Museum, where archived newspapers from the early 70s were kept. She needed context, a timeline, a pattern, anything. Inside, dust floated like snowflakes in shafts of afternoon light. A librarian named Miriam Hayes, white hair pinned neatly, led her to the archives. You looking for someone in particular? Miriam asked. Santos opened her notebook, tapping Evelyn's name. I want everything printed in 71 related to her disappearance. Miriam nodded. I remember that year. The town never felt the same afterward. As Santos sifted through old headlines, local mother missing, community searches, a smaller article caught her eye from 2 months before Evelyn vanished. Local hardware store owner injured in basement accident, recovering. Richard Lawson. Santos felt her pulse kick up. Had someone else been in that basement before Evelyn disappeared? And if so, had Lawson seen something or done something? The past was no longer quiet. It was waking up. One headline, one memory, one secret at a time. Detective Laura Santos stared at the faded headline for a long moment. Local hardware owner injured. Fall in basement leads to short hospital stay. It was dated August 1971, 8 weeks before Evelyn Harper disappeared. Santos leaned closer, reading every line of the small article. According to the report, Richard Lawson suffered a head injury after tripping over construction materials at a residential build site. Lawson had claimed he'd visited a house his store was supplying with concrete and tools. He slipped, struck his head on a support beam, and was hospitalized overnight for observation. The address wasn't printed, but the date lined up with the Carter brothers building 218 Lawson Street, the same house where Evelyn was found. Santos flipped to another page. A follow-up interview quoted Lawson saying, "Don't know who was in the basement after I left. Someone moved my equipment. Whole place felt wrong that day." A line struck her harder than she expected. Wrong that day. Santos folded the newspapers once, carefully, as though afraid they might tear. She thanked Miriam Hayes and stepped outside. The sky hung heavy with clouds, threatening rain. It matched the weight in her chest. She stood beside her car for a moment, phone in hand. She needed help sifting through the decades, someone who carried the memory of the case in their bones. She dialed. The phone rang twice. "Cold case," a steady voice answered. "Frank," she said, "it's Santos. I need your eyes on something." Frank Moreno had been the cold case detective before her, inheriting the Harper file in the mid-'80s. He'd retired 10 years ago, yet his mind remained a locked vault of community history, a vault Santos depended on more than she admitted. "Santos," he replied, his tone warming. "Tell me you're calling because of what they found on Lawson Street." "I am, and I need you to come in. There are threads I don't want to pull alone." Frank chuckled softly, not out of humor, but understanding. "On my way." They agreed to meet at the station. By late afternoon, Frank walked into the conference room just as the rain began. His hair was thinner, silver at the temples, but his presence commanded respect. Santos spread out documents, photos, copies of 1971 statements, and the article about Lawson's accident. Frank put on his glasses, leaning over the papers. "Damn," he murmured. "Haven't seen some of these in years." "Look at this," Santos said, tapping the article. He read it twice, lips pressing into a line. "I remember this. Lawson avoided talking about that accident like it was embarrassing. Said he slipped on spilled mortar." "Do you believe that?" Santos asked. Frank hesitated. "Back then, I didn't think twice. But the Harper case was months later. We were drowning in leads, and none led anywhere." Santos walked to the whiteboard and wrote 3 names in bold strokes. Evelyn Harper, Daniel Carter, Richard Lawson. 3 names from the same summer, 3 stories circling the same house. Frank crossed his arms. "You think Lawson saw something in that basement, something he didn't realize mattered?" Santos nodded. "Or someone moved something, or someone, after his accident." Frank exhaled. "The Carters built that house, but nobody ever asked what happened between the completion date and the day Evelyn vanished." He looked up, eyes clear with renewed purpose. "Let's find out who had keys, who went in and out, who disappeared from records after 71. They worked late into the evening. Santos pulled property permits, construction logs, delivery slips. Frank combed through archived interviews, rereading statements with fresh suspicion. Hours passed. Outside, rain tapped against the windows like fingers urging them onward. Near midnight, Santos stretched, neck aching. Frank removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "That's enough for tonight. But Santos, whatever we're chasing, it didn't start with the wall. That was the end. We need the beginning." Santos nodded. "Tomorrow, we go back to Lawson." The next morning, Santos stood once more inside Lawson Street Hardware. The place smelled of sawdust and motor oil. Richard Lawson was stocking shelves when she approached. "Detective," he said, offering a cautious nod. "What brings you back?" "I found something. An old article. Says you were heard to the construction site in 71. Lawson swallowed hard. A subtle movement, but Santos saw it. "I remember." "Was that the Lawson Street house?" A long pause. Finally, Lawson whispered, "Yes." Santos felt her pulse tick upward. "Tell me about that day." Lawson leaned on the counter as though he needed the support. "I went to drop off supplies, concrete mix, replacement tools. The basement was damp, always was. I slipped on wet cement powder and hit my head. Woke up in the hospital." "Who helped you?" Santos asked. Lawson frowned. What? You said someone moved your equipment after you fell. Who? Lawson shook his head slowly. I assumed Dan came by, or his dad, or Samuel. He hesitated. But the truth is, when I went back days later, the basement looked different, like someone had cleaned up. Santos leaned closer. Cleaned up how? Things weren't where I left them, and the air felt, I don't know, heavy. Santos felt a chill. Did you ever speak to Dan Carter about that again? Lawson hesitated, then lowered his voice. A few months later, after Evelyn disappeared, Dan came to the store late one night. He looked destroyed. I asked if he was okay. He said, "Ever make a choice you can't undo?" Then he left. Santos felt her hand loosen on her notebook, not because she was calm, but because her grip had gone weak. "Mr. Lawson," Santos said steadily, "why didn't you tell anyone?" Lawson blinked, eyes glistening. Dan was my friend, and I convinced myself it meant nothing, that Evelyn was just gone. People here wanted to believe she left on her own. It was easier.
Santos stared at him, not with anger, but something more complex, understanding, frustration, sadness. People wanted to forget, Lawson whispered, but grief doesn't vanish. It turns into silence instead. Santos closed her notebook. Did Evelyn ever mention leaving Harbor County? No, Lawson said softly. She loved her kids. She'd never leave them. Santos left the store as freezing rain began to fall, the drops striking her coat like needles. She got into her car, engine idling, and stared at the steering wheel, suddenly feeling the weight Evelyn must have felt 50 years ago. A mistake, a secret, a love that demanded truth. Santos reached for her phone, not Frank this time, but someone else, someone who rarely spoke of 1971. The call rang once. A weary voice answered. "This is Rebecca Harper, Evelyn's daughter, now in her 50s, old enough to have children Evelyn never met." "Rebecca," Santos said quietly, "I'm Detective Laura Santos. I'm calling because I believe I might know why Evelyn disappeared." There was silence on the line, a breath, a tremble. Rebecca whispered, "I've waited my whole life to hear those words." Santos closed her eyes, firming her resolve. "We need to meet." And as she drove toward the Harper family home, she thought of Evelyn's last morning, buying light bulbs she never used, walking into a future she never saw. 50 years of questions were collapsing inward now, converging on a simple truth. Someone didn't want Evelyn to speak, and Santos intended to find out who and why before the past buried another voice. Detective Laura Santos pulled into the driveway of a modest beige house at the edge of Brookfield, 10 miles south of Harbor County. The sky was bruised purple with approaching dusk. Porch light glowed over a welcome mat worn thin from decades of footsteps. A tricycle sat tipped on its side near the garage, a reminder that life continued here, even without the person whose absence shaped everything. Santos took a breath before ringing the bell. Footsteps approached, slow but steady. The door opened to reveal Rebecca Harper, mid-50s, auburn hair streaked with gray, her mother's hair, same freckles across the nose, same dark eyes that seemed to hold the echo of unanswered questions. For a moment, Rebecca simply stared at Santos, fingers tightening around the edge of the door. Then she stepped back. "Come in," she whispered. The living room was filled with framed photos, Rebecca with her children, her brother Michael Harper, grandchildren Evelyn never met. And among them, one picture stood out, a black and white portrait of Evelyn Harper, smiling in front of the old house on Maple Street. Santos had seen the photo in the case file, but here it felt different, not evidence, but memory. Rebecca motioned toward the sofa. They sat. "You said you might know why she disappeared," Rebecca said,
voice trembling slightly. "No one said that to me in 50 years." Santos folded her hands. "I can't promise answers yet, but I've found connections between your mother, the Carter brothers, and Richard Lawson. I believe your mother knew someone linked to the house where she was found." Rebecca's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. "When I was little, police came every year or so, asked the same questions. Dad would shut down, my brother would leave the room." She paused. "What makes this different?" Santos didn't sugarcoat it. "We found signs your mother may have been in a relationship she hid, someone she trusted, someone who might have panicked." Rebecca's lips tightened, grief turning sharp. "And sealed her behind a wall?" The room fell quiet. Rebecca stared at the framed photograph of Evelyn on the mantel. "I don't remember her voice," she whispered, "just the smell of vanilla and how she'd touch my shoulder when she wanted my attention. I've spent my whole life trying to make that enough." Santos swallowed gently. "I'm sorry." Rebecca composed herself, straightening her posture. "What do you need from me? Anything your father said near the end, anything that didn't make sense at the time." Rebecca's expression shifted, slowly, like someone dusting off an old drawer long ignored. She stood and disappeared into the back of the house. Santos heard the soft creak of floorboards, drawers opening, faint rustling. After a minute, Rebecca returned holding a cardboard box, small, taped once at the corners, edges worn.
"I found this after Dad died," she said, setting the box on the coffee table. "Never opened it. I was afraid it would tell me something I couldn't forgive." Santos nodded in understanding. "Would you like me to?" Rebecca slid the box toward her. "Please." Santos peeled back the tape and lifted the lid. Inside were several objects wrapped in aging tissue paper. A dried corsage, a movie ticket stub dated June 1971, a small notebook with cracked leather binding. Santos opened the notebook first. Inside were handwritten messages, not Evelyn's. The handwriting was blockier, masculine. "May 5th. She smiled at me today. I don't deserve that." June 14th. "I told her I feel alive around her. She didn't run." July 3rd. "She wants me to leave. I want to. God help me." The entries were short, emotional, unfinished, no names, but one line near the back sent chills through Santos. October 12th. "Tomorrow is the day. She said no more secrets." Rebecca covered her mouth. "That's the day she disappeared." Santos whispered the thought neither wanted to speak. "This looks like the handwriting of Daniel Carter." Rebecca's shoulders slumped, understanding rearranging the past. So she didn't just disappear, she trusted someone. Santos nodded. Someone who wasn't her husband. Rebecca exhaled shakily. Then what happened in that house? Why would she go there? Santos considered the timeline. If Evelyn told Daniel she was ending the secrecy, that she wanted honesty, he might have felt cornered. He might have panicked. Rebecca's gaze hardened, not at Santos, but at the truth forming between them. Secrets in fear built that wall, not concrete. Santos gently closed the notebook. "I'll need to take this with me. It could be crucial." Rebecca nodded, voice hoarse. "Take it. Just bring her justice." Santos stood to leave. Rebecca walked her to the porch. The wind carried the smell of rain over damp earth. In the fading lights, Rebecca looked eerily like the woman from the photos, Evelyn's legacy, living what Evelyn never could. "Detective," Rebecca said quietly, "if someone else knew, someone who helped cover this up, will they face consequences?" Santos hesitated, the legal reality tangled with the emotional one. "If they're alive, and if they withheld evidence, yes." Rebecca nodded once, eyes sharp. "Good." Santos got into her car. Rebecca remained on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, as if holding the weight of memory close. Santos watched her for a moment before reversing down the driveway. Rain began to fall as she headed toward the station, slow at first, then steady, drumming on the windshield like a heartbeat. At the office, Frank Moreno was waiting, coffee in hand, eyes alert. "You look like you found something," he said. Santos set the notebook on the table. Frank picked it up, flipping slowly through the pages. His expression darkened. "This matches Dan Carter's signature on all the permits, no doubt."
Santos exhaled. Rebecca had it. Never opened the box. Her father must have kept it hidden. Frank looked up sharply. Harold Harper knew? "We can't know for sure," Santos said, "but he might have guessed. Maybe he couldn't face it." Frank rested both hands on the table. "So we have motive, opportunity, emotional escalation, but she wasn't found in the Carter home. She was sealed in a house he built. Why there?" Santos leaned back. "Because the construction wasn't finished, because no one would question work noises in a basement, because Dan knew how to hide something behind concrete." Dan nodded grimly. "Then we need to find proof." Santos opened her notebook. "We start with Daniel Carter's belongings, journals, personal letters, anything." Frank raised an eyebrow. "After 50 years, where would those be?" Santos tapped her pen twice, thinking. Then her eyes widened. "Samuel Carter," she said. "He said Dan left things behind when he sold the business, things he couldn't throw away." Frank stood immediately. "We need to talk to him again." Santos grabbed her coat, rain still pounding outside, wind rattling the windows. As they left the station, Frank paused, looking up at the storming sky. "You feel it?" he asked. Santos nodded, heart steady. "Yeah," she whispered. "The truth is close. I can feel it too." They drove into the night, toward the Carter property, unaware that someone else had finally realized the case wasn't resting anymore, and that someone did not want old secrets brought into the light. The rain hadn't let up by the time Detective Laura Santos and retired Detective Frank Moreno reached Samuel Carter's property again. Wind whipped through the trees, dark clouds settling low over Lake Michigan. The storm felt symbolic, as though the past itself was boiling to the surface, refusing to stay quiet any longer. They walked up the path, Santos knocking firmly. After a moment, the door opened, and Samuel Carter blinked at them through tired eyes. "You're back," he said, voice soft, resignation coloring each word. "Come in." The interior looked the same, warm lighting, wood-paneled walls, family photos, but Santos sensed a tension in the air. Or maybe it was just Samuel, who seemed braced for something he'd long tried to avoid. "We found something," Santos said as they sat. "A notebook written by your brother. He mentions Evelyn, mentions secrets." Samuel lowered his head, fingers curling around the armrest. Dan was never good at letting go of things he felt. Santos didn't waste time. "Samuel, we believe there may be more of his writings, journals, letters, anything that might explain what happened between him and Evelyn Harper." Samuel stared at the fireplace as if watching something in the flames only he could see. After a long pause, he stood without a word and walked to a hallway closet. They heard boxes being shifted, wood scraping, a muted thump. When he returned, he held an old metal toolbox, the kind that could outlive its owner. "This is what he left behind," Samuel said, placing it gently on the table. "I couldn't bring myself to throw it away." Santos's hands hovered over the latches. She looked at Samuel. He nodded once. She opened it. Inside, wrapped carefully in a cloth, rested 3 leather-bound journals, edges flaking, pages browned with time. Beneath them were folded blueprints of 218 Lawson Street, a small bag of rusted keys, and a photograph of Dan and Evelyn, taken in secret. Evelyn hadn't been smiling in this picture. She looked serious, determined, as if she had just made a decision. Santos lifted the first journal.
On the inner cover, in Dan's heavy script, read,
"If I can't speak the truth aloud, I'll speak it here." Frank drew in a breath. He wanted to confess. Santos opened to a page dated October 11th, 1971, the day before Evelyn disappeared. "E says we tell the truth this week. She says she doesn't want to hide anymore. She wants me to choose. I love her, but if I choose her, I lose everything else. Father, Samuel, the business, the life I built. I told her I need more time. She said time is up." Santos's pulse thudded in her ears. She turned the page. "I can't lose her. I'd rather lose myself." She closed the journal, knuckles whitening. Frank exhaled. "We have motive now, and emotional pressure, but the wall, that room, that took planning. It wasn't built in a day." Santos nodded. If Dan killed Evelyn, he might have had help sealing her away, or someone else discovered the wall later and chose silence. Samuel looked up with reddened eyes. "Detective, if you're thinking I helped—" Santos lifted a hand gently. "We're not accusing you, but we need to know the truth." Samuel's voice cracked. "I swear, I didn't know what happened. I only suspected. When Dan shut down, I thought he'd ended things badly. I didn't think murder." Santos believed him, not because she could prove it, but because grief hung in his voice like a weight he'd carried alone too long. Frank picked up the second journal. "We'll need to process these officially." Santos nodded and reached for the bag of old keys. A dozen shapes, long, short, brass, iron, clinked softly as she moved them in her palm. These unlocked something. Maybe the basement before the wall was poured. Samuel swallowed. "There's one more thing, something I didn't think mattered at the time." He walked to his desk and returned with a yellowed envelope, unopened. "Dan gave me this a year before he died, told me not to read it unless the past came calling." He looked at Santos. "I think that time is now." Santos opened the envelope carefully. A single sheet of lined paper, handwriting shaking as if Dan had written through tears or trembling hands. "Sam, I can't carry this alone anymore. I hurt someone I loved. I didn't mean to, but I did. She fell. She stopped breathing. I panicked. I did something unforgivable. I tried to fix it the only way I knew. I buried the truth. Don't hate me. I was weak. I was scared. If they ever find her, tell them I wasn't a monster, just a coward with a hammer and too much pride." Santos closed her eyes. Frank bowed his head. Samuel's hands shook violently until he clasped them to still them. "I should have opened it years ago," he whispered. "Maybe then someone could have found her sooner." Santos reached across the table, resting her hand over his, grounding him, not judging him. "You didn't build that wall," she said softly, "but you're helping take it down now." Samuel's eyes filled. "What happens next?" Santos inhaled. "We go to Lawson. Someone else knew something. He was there before the wall was finished, and his equipment was moved. If he recognized anything—" Frank finished the sentence. "It means Dan wasn't alone in that basement afterward." They stood to leave, journals in hand, but as Santos reached for the doorknob, a car pulled into the driveway. Headlights flared through the front windows, stopping inches behind her vehicle. Santos froze. Frank stepped beside her. Samuel moved to the curtain, peering out. His face paled. "It's him," he whispered. "It's Richard Lawson." Before Santos could respond, the old hardware owner was already halfway up the porch steps, shoulders hunched against the rain, something clenched in his hand. A flashlight? No. An envelope. Santos opened the door before he knocked. Lawson blinked at her, rain dripping from his hair and coat. His expression held something unfamiliar, the raw vulnerability of a man whose secrets were finally outpacing his lies. "We need to talk," Lawson said heavily. Santos stared him down. Now's the time. Lawson swallowed hard. I can't run from it anymore. She stepped aside. Come in. Lawson entered slowly, and when he saw Samuel Carter standing in the living room, their eyes locked, decades of tension crackling between them. Lawson's voice wavered. I should have said something 50 years ago. Samuel's reply was a whisper of shattered trust. Why didn't you? Lawson opened the envelope, revealing a single brittle photograph, the same basement Santos had seen in crime scene photos, but decades earlier, before the wall was built. Something, or someone, lay wrapped beneath a tarp. Samuel staggered back, Frank's face drained of color. Santos felt the floor tilt, the timeline shifting, the narrative expanding. Lawson's voice broke. I didn't kill her, he whispered, but I saw the body before the wall went up, and I kept quiet. Silence filled the room, heavy, suffocating. The final piece wasn't who killed Evelyn, it was who helped bury her. And Lawson had just admitted his role. Evelyn Harper hadn't just been sealed behind a wall. She had been silenced by one man's panic and another man's fear. Santos inhaled slowly. The truth was almost whole. Only one question remained. Why didn't Lawson speak, and who else knew? She looked at Lawson with steady eyes. Tell me everything.
Detective Laura Santos didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. It felt as though the room itself had frozen. Every sound swallowed by the weight of Richard Lawson's admission. He stood trembling in the center of Samuel Carter's living room, rainwater dripping from his coat, hands shaking as though his body had finally surrendered to the guilt he'd carried half a century. Frank Moreno stood to Santos's right, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on Lawson like a man watching a ghost reveal itself. Santos broke the silence. Start at the beginning. Lawson swallowed hard, gripping the envelope as though afraid it would disappear if he let go. It was October 14th, he said quietly. The day she vanished. I was working late at the store, closing paperwork. Dan came in after dark. Didn't knock, just barged in. He looked destroyed. Shirt was wrinkled, hands shaking. I'd never seen him like that. Samuel sank into the nearest chair, bracing himself. Lawson continued, voice wavering. He said he'd hurt someone he cared for. He didn't give a name, but I knew. Everyone knew he was in love with Evelyn, even if no one said it out loud back then. Santos felt a tightness in her throat. The notebook, the journals, the photo. Pieces of a story finally aligning. What did he ask you to do? Santos asked, tone steady but sharp. Lawson closed his eyes. He asked me to help him fix his mistake. I thought he meant talk to her, apologize. I didn't imagine. He paused, voice breaking. I followed him to the Lawson Street house. He said he left something in the basement. When we got there, he just stood, frozen at the top of the stairs. Wouldn't go down. I took the flashlight and walked into the basement myself. Rain tapped against the windows like restless fingers. I saw her, wrapped in tarp, just lying there. He couldn't do anything, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I told him he had to call the police, tell the truth, but he said he'd lose everything, said no one would understand. Santos rested one hand on the back of the armchair to keep herself grounded. And instead of calling us, he started mixing concrete? Lawson nodded slowly. I left that night. I couldn't watch. But I came back the next morning, and the next, hoping he'd done the right thing. He hadn't. His chin trembled. I helped him move supplies inside. I held the flashlight while he built the frame. I didn't know what he planned, not exactly, but I knew enough to walk away. And I did. I walked away and never looked back.
Samuel stared at Lawson, not with anger, but something deeper, heavier. "You could have told someone," Samuel said quietly, voice fragile. "You could have given her back to her family." Lawson nodded once, slow, deliberate, tears filling his eyes. "I know." Frank leaned forward. "Why now? Why talk after 50 years? Lawson exhaled. "Because once they found her, I couldn't pretend anymore. I dream about her every night. I see her standing at the hardware counter, smiles small and hopeful, like she's waiting for a future she'd never reach. I didn't kill her, detective, but I helped bury her, and that's a weight no man can carry forever."
Santos stepped closer. "There's one thing I don't understand. If you didn't help build the wall, then why did your tools move when you were injured months before?" Lawson sat slowly on the edge of the couch. "Because Dan was already thinking about hiding something. Evelyn was pulling away. He was scared. I think he was preparing for the worst before the worst even happened." Santos let that sink in. Dan hadn't built the wall in a moment of panic. He'd known, on some level, that the truth might demand a tomb. The storm outside began to ease, rain softening to mist. Santos gathered the journals and the photograph, then looked Lawson in the eyes. "You're going to give a full formal statement," she said, "and it will be submitted with the journals and the notebook. The prosecutor will determine charges." Lawson nodded, almost relieved. Samuel stared at him, pain deep in his gaze. "I wish you'd told me the truth when he died," he whispered. Lawson's voice shook. "I was afraid you'd hate me." Samuel exhaled, a long, weary breath. "I hate what happened, but hate won't give her back. Truth might." Santos could tell those words cost Samuel something, a release of anger he'd worn like armor. Frank stood, placing a steadying hand on Samuel's shoulder. "You did the right thing today," he said quietly. "Most never do." Lawson looked to Santos again. "Will her children know?" Santos nodded. "They deserve to." 2 weeks later, Rebecca Harper and her brother Michael Harper sat across from Santos in a conference room at the station. Santos laid out the journals, the notebook, Lawson's statement, the whole truth, not the rumors they grew up with. Rebecca didn't cry, though her hands shook. Michael clenched and unclenched his fists, jaw tight. When Santos finished, Rebecca whispered, "Did she fight?" Santos answered honestly, "I think she fought to be heard, and she wasn't." Rebecca nodded slowly, "But she will be now." Santos felt her chest tighten, not with sorrow, but with a quiet, unwavering conviction. Evelyn Harper didn't vanish into nothing. She was remembered, sought, fought for, until the concrete finally broke. On a bright morning in early June, a memorial service was held at Harbor View Cemetery. Evelyn's remains were laid to rest beside Harold's headstone, reunited at last. Samuel Carter attended in silence. Richard Lawson stood alone near the back, head bowed, awaiting the consequences still ahead. Detective Laura Santos watched Evelyn's children place their hands on the casket. For the first time since she took the case, Santos exhaled, not because the work was done, but because the story was finally whole. Rebecca looked up, catching Santos' gaze. No words passed. None were needed. Santos turned away as a fresh breeze rustled the leaves, sunlight warming her shoulders. She imagined for a moment Evelyn standing in that warmth, laughing, alive, holding the hands of her children again. Some stories end loudly, some end in silence. But this one ended in truth. And truth, even after 50 years, is still justice. Before we close this chapter, let me say this. If this story moved you, If you believe every family deserves answers, no matter how much time has passed, please subscribe to the channel to join us in exploring other cold cases across America. Thank you for following the Evelyn Harper case.